had a few mentions already today from other panels that have tipped their hat towards the supply chain as an area in which we're already beginning to see the rubber hit the road, right? A lot of what's been discussed is high concept or venture capital investment, or the future might be about judgment, not prediction, but this is really a part of the business value chain that things are already happening. And I wondered if we could get a feeling on how are companies applying some of the tools that we've seen that we've talked about all day, digitizing the supply chain, whether it's going all the way back to the traditional use of RFIDs, to the more glamorous Internet of Things, as we call it now, to maybe even applying some forms of machine learning to the knowledge that they're getting from this. And I thought maybe, Tom, we could start with you. If you could give us a sense of the real benefits in this space. What have we seen? What can our audience members chew on that isn't just another panel that talks on and they leave with nothing in their pockets?
Sure, yeah, thanks, Vijay, and thanks for having us. Being able to close the gap between what you think is going on inside your operations and what actually is going on, I think one of the previous panelists, Stephen Wolcott, had said it quite interestingly when he said, being able to deliver value at the moment it's needed. So moving that value closer and closer to the on-demand moment. And so what we see is the opportunity to close visibility gaps, to capture information at the edge of a network, what's happening, what goods are being picked up. Think about carriers today. They wake up on a given day, and 50% of what they're shipping they may not even know about until the day of. So being able to move into a day of way of operating as opposed to a rigid plan, and closing that gap between what you think is happening in your operations and where things are going and what actually is happening, and creating what we call a system of reality as opposed to a system of record. So capturing information at the edge of the network, we said earlier in similar words, being able to analyze that data and then taking the next best action. And so we're seeing this play out particularly in what has become really the on-demand economy, where over the next 3 years, 15% of all shipments are going to be delivered on demand. They're going to be delivered within 3 hours. And 5 years after that, it's going to be 25%. So think about that. 1/4 of everything we order online is going to be on our doorstep in a matter of a couple of hours. And so to do that, you've got to capture the information sooner at the point of pickup, be able to use that information to downstream plan more effectively right in the moment, bring that value right to the moment of demand, and then use that to run a more efficient and better operations to be able to deliver that on that customer experience, which I heard the term liquid expectations earlier, which I hadn't heard before. That is the expectation in transportation logistics and the supply chain by consumers. That's the experience they have everywhere else. It's the experience they expect from the supply chain.
So you're giving, and for this I applaud you, the perspective from the user or the customer, right? I mean, it seems to me that's always where we should start. How does this affect the person who is paying for the product or who's creating the demand? But if I were to row it back a little bit, it's, look under the hood and ask, what is it, from the technologies we've talked about today that are helping companies to do this, the ones that are doing it successfully?
Right.
Because I also hear an awful lot of data deluge, right? I mean, arguably companies were flying blind in the past, but they were blissfully blind, right? I mean, they didn't know what they didn't know. Now they've got an awful lot of data, and they don't always have the ways of making sense of them.
Yeah.
When I started at The Economist many moons ago, the old joke in business journalism was, if only Siemens knew what Siemens knows. And I think that joke could still be applied today to many companies, right? So how far have we really come? And if you could be a little bit concrete, and I'll ask my other panelists the same question, make it concrete on where you think the advances are happening.
Yeah, so absolutely there's a data deluge out there. I mean, one of the terms we've started to use is this notion of a digital diary. Being able to play back what's happening in an environment and capture all that information and be able to play it back to learn what can be done better next time. But with the advent of a lot of the other topics we spoke about in the previous panels, machine learning, so this combination of collection of data, machine learning, derive insights, and then drive the next best action. And so where we're seeing this play out, think about fork truck utilization, which Michael could talk about in a cross-dock facility. We've seen typically, on average, there's 50% utilization of those fork trucks because the other 50% of the time they're driving around with empty forks, right? Looking for what they should be picking up. Well, if we could create the digital diary, if we can know where every piece of palletized freight is, or we can know where every package that needs to be picked up by that fork truck is located. And we know the location of those fork trucks. And we know from a legacy enterprise resource planning perspective what orders need to be delivered next, right? Which we've already got that information from legacy systems of records. We can fuse that all together to route optimize inside that cross-dock facility. So now you can take that fork truck utilization from 50% to 80+%. And you think about the benefit that brings to the bottom line of that organization, the benefit it brings to the customer on faster shipments. So it's collecting this data, and it's driving capital asset utilization up, or it's delivering on a better customer experience, or it's just changing the business model. It's changing the access you can have to customers because you have this new information, the dialogue you can have with your customers because you now have this information. And in the best of cases, it's all three at once. And they're real examples of that.
Now, you make a very compelling case. But Michael, you have talked in the past about how early adopters have challenges. I mean, if we all hear his siren song and say, this is great, sign me up, you might have to adopt new systems, new ways of doing things with imperfect data, for example. So can you talk a little bit about the opportunity, but also the challenges of being early adopters?
Sure. I think the issue is that all organizations, whether we're a logistics solution company, and we've been around for some time, and you've got an existing set of technologies that support the existing operations. And so if you're running at 3% of technology on a percent of revenue basis, or 4%, or whatever that baseline is compared to your peers, you've got to have a view on that new technology about what it's going to do for the business. And I think that's heightened in the last decade because I think about the array of opportunities, whether it's RFID or it's any other the real-time location technologies. You could have 2 to 3 dozen of these kind of initiatives sitting in front of you. And so you've got to be able to, I think organizations have got to be able to say, okay, what is my run the business cost? What's my run the business expense? Benchmark that, and then everything else I've got to manage like a portfolio, all the tools that Tom's talking about. So what's the individual use case for each one of these initiatives? What does that mean in terms of operations efficiency? What's that mean in terms of the customer experience? It's about getting back to the value and then treating it like a true portfolio. And so to me, that's an early adopter challenge. I've loved the discussion today about that it really is an investment. It's about having a mind around execution, but also understanding what's the potential in the discovery, and keeping that duality in check as you make these investments.
What do you think?
Maybe a point that ties those two things together about the volume of data that's out there as well as this early adopter issue. I think all of my work's in the industrial space, and around the data issue and people that are starting to get involved on some of the early projects, where I'm really trying to focus people, and I think there's much more intake on this, although it's not sexy at all, is around data architecture and data hygiene. Because the issue is, you'll try to implement some of these technologies, if the underlying data is not right around things like product attributes, cross-referencing information, then you can have the best technology overlay around that. If the foundational data isn't correct, then what you end up with is a bunch of this unactionable data set.
It's the old garbage in, garbage out, right?
But it's the least sexy thing to talk about. So you'll be in a meeting, and people are really excited about implementing some new upgrade to the e-commerce system or something else from a supply chain standpoint. But it is absolutely ineffective unless all of the underlying data architecture and then the ongoing hygiene around that's really well done. It almost becomes unactionable what comes out the other end of it.
It's just a waste, isn't it?
Right.
And speaking of waste, actually, I happen to know that our academic expert on this panel works with waste streams to figure out very useful data in smart cities.
Yep.
And aside from the pun, which is unforgivable, I apologize, it's also, there's a lesson about the timeliness of the data that I wondered if you'd share that anecdote with us.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I work mostly with cities, and if you look at a city, it's the quintessential operations problem. How do we get effective services quickly to people in a way that actually improves their quality of life? So we do this by tapping into digital breadcrumbs that we're leaving behind in our cities, But we also mine data from sources that you wouldn't think about otherwise, or we're mining data that's not already being generated. So to that effect, one of the projects that I've been working on, we're extracting information on human health from wastewater. And so we're actually deploying a network of low-cost robotics in cities below manhole covers that are extracting information on human-derived viruses, bacteria, and chemicals to give us a snapshot of the health of a specific community. And
You thought you had a terrible job. Wait, are you actually climbing down these manholes, or you've got your team and your robots doing all this?
No, so the robots are going down the manholes, but for the last year and a half, it's been myself, hands-on, with a couple other researchers, actually deploying these things. But now we're trying to kind of offload the operations onto the city and have them absorb that. But if you would have asked me 3 years ago, I would never have thought I'd be doing this. But what we are realizing here is that, how real time do we really need to get? Because, of course, we can start to put all of our efforts into updating our technology and building out, these sensor suites that are giving us real-time information on a lot of these pathogens. But cities don't necessarily need that. It feeds into this data deluge that is overwhelming for cities right now. And if we can just provide this baseline information on the health of various communities in a city, let's say once a month, that's already astronomically better than the data that they're currently looking at to understand the health of their communities.
Right, so that's low-hanging fruit there in that
Exactly.
case. Right? Although, just to stick with the theme of cities, there may be other kinds of sensors for which you do want real-time information. For example, the snowplows in many cities now have sensors on them, and so they can tell you which streets have been plowed and which haven't, which is very useful on a snow day, whether which back road you should or shouldn't take. You do want current information for something like that.
Absolutely. Yeah, and there's another example of a city sensing initiative that started in Boston and is now operational in Chicago as well, is ShotSpotter. And that's essentially like an acoustic sensor package or a black box that the city puts in communities, and it detects the specific audio frequency of a gunshot. And triangulates the location and sends a ping to the police station, and they know that a shooting has just happened and they can come here. Now, just the knowledge of these, sensor boxes being around in cities have dramatically decreased gun violence gun violence in Boston. I don't know the statistics about Chicago, but
is that
it's
really
similar.
True? Sorry, this is not really about supply chain, but why would knowing that my gunshot is going to be captured by a sensor, if I were to be a criminal or thug, why would that determine any way?
So what it's done is it's increased the rapid response from police. It's pinpointing the location where it happens, and within minutes.
Okay, well, there's a great answer, isn't there? Yeah. Okay, it's not that I'm
So
embarrassed. I don't want to get caught. Okay. Yes.
That's where real-time data.
There we go. No, I'm
VJ's not going to shoot his gun now.
Okay, I've got to use bows and arrows from now on or something. I don't know. Right. Okay. Now, we have a later session on blockchain, but can any of you point to any examples of the use of blockchain in supply chain that you've run across? We're taking the question of digital supply chain to its extreme. Is this something that any of you work with or have come across?
Starting to hear conversations about it, but it's generally the question you just asked, which is, where is this going? How is this going to apply? I haven't had a company that's utilized it yet to make a change.
So I ran across an example. I'm based in China. I'm the China business editor. And recently, I've just had a discussion with Walmart. One of the big problems in China is food safety. There's a lot of adulteration. Many of you would know from the headlines that insecurity of the milk, the meat, it's a terrible problem. And a lot of it has to do with trust, bad actors within the supply chain. And so Walmart, which sells a lot of pork at its outlets in China, has introduced blockchain from the farm all the way down to the retail stores. Right. And in speaking with the person at Bentonville who's in charge of this, it became pretty clear this was really about trust, that because you have with blockchain, obviously a completely transparent multi-party verification system, people can't lie about when they did what with what. And so that was really the reason. They weren't trying to be hip or cool or anything else. It solved a business problem for them, and that there was no other method they could come up with that was able to work, and they're very pleased with the early results. And so that seemed to me an interesting case. And I wonder if there are other examples out there that people in the audience, in your own work, or you run across. But I do think that some of the advances may come from the edge, not from where we think they're going to come. Yeah. And again, for a hard-nosed business reason, that we couldn't find another solution to it. Not because this promises to make everything better or it's a big disruption or revolution, but because there's a business problem that we can't solve with existing tools. Yeah. So I wonder that's where maybe some of the future of digital supply chain lies.
Haven't seen it yet, but when you think about using your example, things like custodial control from end to end, where that good is moving from across multiple entities, from manufacturer to a whole host of transporters to the end destination, right. And the opportunity, which is obviously a huge issue, of injecting counterfeit merchandise into there as well. So being able to use RFID technologies where you've got rewritable tags, being able to take a blockchain sequence as it's moving from entity to entity and then re-inject that into, say, an RFID tag as an example, to make sure that you've got the custodial control and proof from sort of manufacturer to end destination. It's kind of absolutely interesting. I haven't come across use cases yet, but I suppose they're on their way.
Well, I think that's really an opportunity to formalize what is generally an informal economy, and so it's not surprising you would see some of that in some earlier stages of the supply chain rather than in North America at this point.
Right, exactly. I mean, in some sense, it's a leapfrog for them, isn't it?
Right.
So they may not even go through some of the traditional stages. Are you finding in your work with the urban supply chain, if we can call it that, for cities, that the greatest innovations are happening in advanced economies or in developing economies? Is it a mixed bag? What do you find?
I would say it's a mixed bag. I'll come back to actually something that Sanjay Sarma said this morning, that cities need to be test beds for innovation. And I think the biggest impediment right now is that...
But don't regulate. Remember
exactly, don't regulate.
Don't regulate it.
And I absolutely agree with that. But there's still this impediment that cities are weary to work with startups or innovation groups within academia or elsewhere, because if they fail publicly, or if any of the initiatives fail, they fail publicly. So I think that the cities are where we're seeing adoption of a lot of innovative technologies or sensing technologies in cities are cities where they've developed some sort of framework by which they can, sign companies or sign initiatives without needing to do RFPs, which startups hate RFPs, or an initiative or an innovation group is not going to respond to an RFP. And so they are spread across, I would say, developed and developing economies. You are seeing some leapfrogging, as you said, as well. So as we see a lot of increased urbanization in places like India and China, they're afforded an opportunity to build smart infrastructure in a way that would be much more costly here in North America or Western Europe. So in the Middle East, when they're just implementing a wastewater infrastructure or a new highway network, they're embedding sensors already in there. Not necessarily sure what to be doing with that data yet, but they're just kind of paving the road, so to speak.
Are there companies that are learning from this example of how to work with innovators, startups, outside groups, even, heaven forbid, academics that might have some cutting edge thinking? I mean, the supply chain industry doesn't have a history of being known as cutting edge, bleeding edge innovators. On the contrary, it's responsible for making sure the goods get there on time, right? So reliability is really the paramount metric that is measured by. Is there a trick to learn from some of these cities that are adapting on how to collaborate with outsiders?
Absolutely. I think we've been almost forced into that situation. I think when I think about our organization, we were probably an albatross in this respect, that most of our IT was internally developed, almost 95% of it, up until about maybe 6 or 7 years ago. We had a very strong focus that we could develop our own ERP systems and financial systems and BI platforms because the cost of that development and long-term support was actually lower. But we realized that because of these emerging technologies that we can't have people writing financial systems, we can't have them writing ERP and CRM systems. And so, and likewise, we've got to source intellectual capital. We've got to have an open innovation aspect that, and we haven't touched on that yet, but around talent, that we need to know what we don't know. And we've got to have, so many of our programs around R&D and innovation, I can't think of one of them that does not have a partner from the outside, whether in academia or a vendor that's maybe across the globe.
Right.
And so that's just a reality, I think, of anyone that's trying to do this.
But I think by definition, supply chains are interdependent. No one controls the supply chain from end to end. So I think that forces people to be collaborative. All of the data set that's out there is owned by all these different parties. I think about in a manufacturing environment, all of the different pieces of OEM equipment that are there, the data streams coming off that are all being controlled in different environments. And so by definition, that causes collaboration, I think, number one. And then number two, because a lot of the supply chain companies are older world types of industries, they may not have these skill sets necessarily internally. And I know in my experience that really drives the need to collaborate in academia with other technology companies, because the skill sets just aren't there. And so I've actually seen over the last 3 to 5 years a huge push of partnering with different engineering labs, with different universities, with different startup organizations to try and figure out how is all this stuff going to come together and who has the kind of best platform to pull all of these things together. So I think it's the supply chain, the interdependence of it by definition is causing a lot of that to happen.
Right. I want to come to the audience for a couple of questions with the time we have left, but let me ask, there was a lot of hype about 3D printing in the last couple of years, or there has been. Depending on which flavor of the hype you believe, it's going to democratize all of manufacturing. Other people say it could actually transform the supply chain or make it irrelevant. Just press a button and your item is made for you in your house. You don't need to deliver anything. So what's the reality check? Maybe we could stick with you, Court, since you've thought about this a little bit here. What do you see as the role of additive manufacturing today? And maybe what do you forecast going forward for this sector?
Yeah, I thought Rob Walcott, and then we've spent time talking about this previously, nailed it in the last discussion group, which is a great way for some portion of the supply chain to deal with the customization opportunity. I don't think you're going to see a situation where additive manufacturing is going to displace the low-cost nature of mass-produced goods, but a great way to provide customized goods in a time-effective way, and I think that's going to continue to grow. The idea that it gets to the house in terms of producing your own seems abstract and a long ways off, but a number of things happening today felt that way 10 years ago too, so that's yet to be seen. But this idea of it being distributed at some point where there's some scale benefit locally makes a lot of sense to me. So on a city basis, on an individual community basis, and then being available for real-time immediate delivery, I think we're starting to see that evolve already. The other thing that, I think it's a quote from Bill Gates that, everyone expects everything to be over-delivered in the short term, and then when it isn't, you start to say, well, it's probably not coming in the long term, and I think Rob mentioned that as well. That's my view of this. It hasn't caught on as quickly as maybe the hype was. I remember reading an Economist cover maybe 4 or 5 years ago, and this is the cover story. Yeah. It hasn't caught on as quickly, but I don't think that means that the long-term impact is any less. I mean, I think it's going to have a huge impact on a quarter to a third of the goods that are produced.
Yeah. Any other thoughts on 3D printing?
Just related to it as an observation, this kind of hyperlocal distribution is something we're seeing more and more, right? So the idea that
sorry, define your term. What is that?
So distribution centers moving closer and closer to the point of delivery. It's back to the Walcott statement there around moving value closer and closer to the point of demand. And so as a result of that, moving distribution centers, using stores, so retail stores now becoming fulfillment centers for online orders. Right. Think about the number of stores and the proximity of those stores to your home. Right. It's much higher than, say, where a warehouse would be located, much more centrally located. That's here and now, it's playing out. So the tie-in with 3D printing, I'm just saying, is that as more and more of those distribution centers become closer and closer to the endpoints they're delivering to, it's going to make sense, as your point, of course, it's not going to get all the way to the home, likely, right? But that you're now going to have a place to house that. Why does that distribution center become an on-demand manufacturing facility using additive 3D printing? That's really, kind of what I'm throwing out there. And the infrastructure is going to be built over the next few years to be able to support that. So the incremental cost to deliver it is going to be close to zero. And that's going to, as we see many times in technology, two independent things develop and then intersect to deliver value that nobody predicted.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you get a different challenge, right? If you went from having 20 large warehouses or 10 to suddenly have 1,000 big box stores that are de facto mini inventory warehouses, right?
Right.
You're-
It's the Clayton Christensen, actually, you mentioned earlier, the disruption that happened to the steel industry because of mini mills. As
Right.
an example for those that are Christensen fans. Yeah.
Yeah, and Professor Christensen has been on our stage, for those of us in the room who've been with the Economist conference before, and among the things he likes to tell the example of one of the US big integrated steel mills, that people like to think that the incumbents don't see change coming. And of course, that's usually not the case. People are smart in business. Incumbents are quite smart, especially ones that have been successful and profitable. And the big integrated mills saw Nucor getting bigger and better, that is the mini mills, and they saw their quality of their steel was getting better and better over time. And one of them, he knew from having talked with the management, actually formulated a plan for building its own mini mills to save the company. And they had the investment plan ready to go. And it was at the last stage of approval when the bean counters came in and said, actually, this is going to be a lower return investment than putting the money back into our traditional business. And they killed the project. And we know the rest of history. So a short-term outlook on financial investment killed what would have ultimately been a proper savings of that industry, or that company anyway. And so in that sense, if we were to look at right now, what if you were to be in the position of that steel company CEO, what is something that might not be the immediate return investment in the digital supply chain today, but if you were to look out 5 or 10 years to save your company, the future of your industry, what's something that you would make a bet that your shareholders next quarter, or the financial analysts following your company, might not be that excited about right now, but which makes sense to you, we should invest for the longer term? What would you do in your realm?
I would look at AR, actually, augmented reality. I think that not only for city management and operations, but also I think this applies to companies as well. Actually increasing the ability of people themselves is the direction that I would go into. And if you can start to, give people information and data, and these are, whether, again, they're city workers or not, I think there's a lot of potential there.
Great. AR, we haven't heard too much about it today. Any other offers, ideas?
I think for me, there's in many cases still the idea, especially in supply chain distribution, of the closed model. And I just think that everything is becoming transparent, whether that's the data coming from IoT, whether that's pricing, whether that's inventory availability across the entire supply chain, across different companies, is embracing the impact of that rather than trying to defend against or preventing it from happening. That full transparency of the entire supply chain end to end is coming. And so getting ready for that, and what that means to business models, and what that means to how you organize your business and your IT infrastructure and your talent around all of that. Doesn't help you in the next 6 months, but I think 6 to 10 years from now, it's mission critical.
Right. Great. Let's see if we've got a question from the audience. Anybody have a challenge to our panel? I see a gentleman in the back.
Yep.
Yes, sir. Please identify yourself.
My name's Nitin Kurana. I work for ITC. As I said earlier, we're a services and solutions company driving solutions into the manufacturing and retail world. So I think it's a really corollary to the question which I asked earlier, which was, somebody in the morning talked about return on IoT, right? How do you measure the return on IoT? And traditionally, a lot of the investments within the manufacturing and retail world were spent around operational excellence, right? ERP and driving supply chain and logistics. So a lot of money has already been kind of spent within the logistics and supply chain space trying to optimize it. Whereas now a lot of the IoT real-time data investment is being spent on the product side. So would you have some tangible examples of how this whole access to real-time data is now going to give us that incremental benefit on the supply chain in terms of, you talked about utilization of capital intensive equipment, or reduction of inventory. Some tangible examples, if you have in terms of tangible benefits.
Maybe just throw a couple of things out there. One is, I think it's a really relevant observation. A number of people made it were saying the same thing slightly different ways, which is the idea of it's not about it's the causality of this. It's not about the connectivity is driving the value. It's about a business problem that can be solved, and the answer is connectivity and Internet of Things. So when you think about the stack to deliver on that, it's sensing information, analyzing, and then taking an action. But the business value, to your point, the return on investment, doesn't come at the sense and analyze layer. It comes at the action layer, right? So what piece of workflow was mentioned earlier too. It's not about IoT, it's about workflow. So how are you going to change your workflow? What actions are you going to take that are different because you have new data new and unique data that you're able to analyze and act on. And so another example, we gave the one around locationing and the fork truck utilization. Another one I can mention that we've got deployed now at actually thousands of dock doors around the country is something we call load analytics. So we have
I'm sorry, what's it called?
Load analytics, trailer load analytics,
Okay.
or container load analytics, where we've got a sensor looking into a trailer or a container, and that sensor combines video with 3D point cloud data. So similar to an Xbox gaming or a controllerless gaming experience, where you're actually moving and it's using the 3D point cloud to detect what your actions are and then introduce those into the gaming environment. We're using a similar kind of sensor to monitor what's happening in the vehicle. So as those boxes and parcels are being loaded into that trailer, we're calculating in real time what's called the cube score, or the volumetric efficiency of that trailer, and we're mobilizing that data right down to handheld units that are in the hands of the dock manager. So you may have a facility with 120 dock doors, and you may have, and think about this, the 1% improvement for a carrier in load efficiency could save millions of dollars a year. It creates a much greener organization in terms of gas consumed. The industry on average has about 70% trailer efficiency, meaning 30% of that trailer is air. So for every 5 trucks they're putting on the road, they could be putting 4 if they could pack that trailer out more efficiently. So here is a great example of using that sensor data, collecting what's actually happening, calculating the cube score in real time, and then mobilizing it to the right people to take action. And the whole point here is, I use the analogy to the Fitbit, is if you're collecting the data of your Fitbit and you let that data get captured in the cloud, you never change your behaviors, you've realized no benefit. You just have a pile of data about your behaviors, of which nobody's ever gotten more healthier by wearing a Fitbit device. They got more healthy because they changed their habits as a result of the data they collected. And likewise...
Oh, is that what I'm doing wrong? I was wondering why this thing wasn't working.
Yes, right. What's going on there? So similarly, in these enterprise use cases, capturing that volumetric load efficiency and then mobilizing it to the right people that can take action is driving that 70% load efficiency to 75% load efficiency, returning money to the bottom line, creating a greener organization, putting less vehicles on the road, and so on. So there's a pretty concrete example of one that also pairs off with the forklift example I gave earlier.
I mean, if we pick up on that example you just gave about the back of the lorry, as we would say
Yes.
in our pages, and combine it with the well-advertised fact that the number one job that's likely to be automated with the largest number of workers in America, at least, is truck driver, right, or lorry driver. So if you have both the front of the cab and the back in a rapid process of transformation, you have a real revolution in the transport industry, don't you, in the shipping industry?
Absolutely.
In possibly the next 5 years, you think? Is that too soon?
Well, we're talking about level 5 autonomy within the next 2.5,
right.
Believe it or not. So, in speaking with a lot of folks in the autonomous industry, Tesla and some of the other third-party providers, they'll tell you the biggest barrier is regulation and not technology. And I think likewise in IoT, the biggest barrier to ourselves and to our organizations is how do we change standard operating procedure that's been in place for decades,
right.
And not so much the technology. So you've really got to embrace how are your employees going to operate differently. And in many cases, we're talking about could be 100,000 people or several 100,000 people have to now wake up and do their job differently every day. Yeah. And I think that's quickly becoming the barrier as opposed to the actual technology. And likewise on the autonomous side, regulatory would play right into that.
You had a quick point.
Just another quick example from the plant floor is I think you've got to move from historically preventative maintenance, which is this machine's run for 1,000 hours or 5,000 hours. So we're going to take it apart and refit some of the key parts that are inside, to really predictive maintenance today, which is through a couple of very simple sensors on a motor. You can understand heat, you can understand vibration, you can very easily predict from that information when that motor is going to fail. And so replacing it a couple of days, a couple of hours before failure, as opposed to just taking things apart and rebuilding them when you don't necessarily need to do so. So I think that's a really quick example. Those sensors are incredibly simple, incredibly inexpensive, and that work's actually happening today on the plant floor.
Yeah. I think the other thing, you've got to have a philosophy on adoption that is a phased approach. A lot of these technologies that we're talking about are at various stages of maturity, and you've got to have a view on what's the return, even if they're not at that mature stage. They're going to mature. We know that these sensors are going to mature. We know that the analytics, the predictive analytics are going to mature as the data becomes mature, because there's an assumption that the data is perfect, and we know that's not the reality. But I think you have to make a bet that that's going to happen and then progress from there.
Right. I see a hand here. Let's get a microphone to this gentleman, please. In the front table.
So Somasundaram.
Please identify yourself, sir.
Yeah, Somasundaram from Dover Corporation. So as we talk about this drive to efficiency through digital supply chain, what are the panel's thoughts about risk mitigation? What risks should we be concerned about? Because we all know sometimes when there is a disruption in supply chain, what it does to industrial companies. So can you talk a little bit about what risks we should be thinking about and what mitigations we should be thinking about?
Somebody want to take that on?
Yeah, I'm not sure I heard that fully.
So the risks of disruption, what does that mean to companies, and what should you be doing to prepare for that forthcoming disruption? So who's at risk, and what do you do about it?
Because one of the inherent things with the drive to efficiency is you forget about risk, because you're trying to squeeze every aspect of efficiency, right?
Right.
So the question is what risks we should be thinking about, and how do we build mitigation around it?
Right. Well, I think what's interesting is that some of the disruptive technologies on their own can actually be pretty helpful from a risk prevention standpoint. So, if you think about the Walmart blockchain example around food safety, that's a situation where you're actually using the technology from a risk mitigation standpoint. I think the biggest issue is that for companies that aren't prepared from a technology infrastructure, from a cultural agility, from a talent standpoint, to be able to implement these things. So if you're in the supply chain, to be able to provide that data, to have the agility within the company to work with customers that are demanding that data, that the business risk inherently comes from that as opposed to something like disintermediation, right? So we heard earlier from an additive manufacturing standpoint, the original idea was that would take distributors and others out of the supply chain. It actually likely increases the importance of them to be these regional endpoints where you can create those items and have them delivered. That all comes back to, do you have the infrastructure, the capability, the culture, the people to get that work done? And so what I see in some of the older world companies is, how do you go get those people? How do you take what is historically and potentially a risk-averse IT culture and old world IT architecture and start to build that in a way that allows you to take advantage of those opportunities? And the risk is that if you don't do that, other people are definitely going to do that. Amazon moving into the supply chain very aggressively is an example. And I think the risk comes from not being prepared to make those investments and make those changes.